Hello, everyone. Welcome to Word on Wednesdays Live,
where we hold the Bible to be the very Word of God, the authority to which we subordinate all other authorities in our lives. Everything's surrendered to God and His Word. Tonight's lesson is the first in a kind of sub-series, I guess, of the broader origins series that we've been doing. For the next 2 or 3 lessons, counting tonight's, I want to talk with you about the inherent racism which I see in the theory of evolution, or more accurately, I believe, the belief system of evolution. First, let me talk about what this sub-series is not going to be about. I have no plans to discuss any aspects of the current buzz topic known as critical race theory. I'm not going to talk about that much
other than right now. Vodi Bakum, the man you see here, solid preacher and a solid biblicist, knows the Bible, has done a thorough critique of critical race theory, of the social justice movement, and how this is tearing the modern church apart. I urge you to get a copy of his book, Fault Lines, if this interests you at all. I highly recommend that book, as well as various video formats on YouTube that feature Mr. Bakum on this very topic. He's worth listening to, and I think you will really enjoy him if you enjoy what we're doing here. So I'm not going to be dealing with CRT or critical race theory here. Here's what I believe. I believe people choose to be racist. Somewhere in their hearts and minds, they make the choice. And they must be held accountable for the choices that they make. People can repent of their low views of other people around them. Unlike what critical race theory says, racism is not hopelessly ensconced in the minds of anyone, regardless of their level of melanin. Critical race theory, therefore, causes racism, folks. It actually instigates it, supports it, causes divide among people. It does not address the root of the problem in the least. The root of the problem is the human heart. It's the sin nature that we have, that we give over to ourselves over to in so many ways, including in this very same one. End of story. Now, you must also understand the Bible's teaching on race. What does the Bible actually teach on race? Well, here's what it says. There are no races. There are no races. Though throughout history, some folks have sought out the Bible to try to find things in the Bible in an attempt to justify their own racist views. People often do that sort of thing whenever they try to justify their own sins. They look to the Bible to try to find some justification. With racism, this is simply impossible to do because the Bible is very clear. God created nations of people, not races of people, okay? Acts 17:26, God has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings. God divided people according to national boundaries and so forth, borders. But he did not divide them according to races. Everyone is made from the same blood, okay? The Bible clearly teaches all people descended from one original pair of humans, and we still call them man and woman at our house, okay? 2 sexes, 2 genders, because that's what the Bible teaches. All right? So since we all have come from one couple, we're all related. One God for one people. There is, if you're going to use the word race at all, there is only one race, and that's the human race. If only we had followed God's plan from the very beginning, God's design for things. If we had done that, there would be no hatred of anyone else due to the shade of brown found in their skin or whatever. Look, no one is white, no one is black. All are variations of a shade of brown or tan, and that unique, beautiful difference is truly only skin deep. It's not the real person. It's what is on the outside, beautiful as it is. Research the word melanin for more information. Melanin. Research that for more information. Go out in the sunshine to get more melanin, okay? Just be very cautious of too much exposure to the sun's rays. Use adequate UV protection, like these people. Well, okay, maybe that's overdoing it a little, but anyhow, you get the point. Okay, enough said on that. Here's something someone else once said about something else. At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes, as Professor Schaffhausen has remarked, will no doubt be exterminated. The break between men and apes. The break will then be rendered wider, for it will intervene between man in a more civilized state, as we may hope, than the Caucasian and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of, as at present, between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. So, one day, in the not too distant future, civilized races will exterminate and replace savage races. That doesn't sound too civilized to me. Eventually, according to this person here, the gap between humans and animals is going to be wider than what it is now, based on evolutionary thinking, obviously. Okay, it'll be wider. It will one day be much more like the difference between a more civilized Caucasian and a baboon than like the present narrower gap between the Negro or the Australian Aboriginal person and the gorillas. You see, they're much closer together on the whole scale. This is a horrifying viewpoint. I mean, who was it that had the gall to say such a thing as that? Well, it was this man, Charles Darwin, in his book, The Descent of Man. He wrote something similar in a letter to a colleague, talking about a battle with the Turks. He says, "Remember what risk the nations of Europe ran not so many centuries ago of being overwhelmed by the Turks, and how ridiculous such an idea now is. The more civilized so-called Caucasian races have beaten the Turkish hollow in the struggle for existence." His words. "Looking to the world at no very distant date, what an endless number of lower races will have been eliminated by the higher civilized races throughout the world." The Turkish hollow, meaning that the Turks were empty, right? They were void. There was no meaning to them. No, they were unfaithful. They were insincere. Their promises were hollow and deceptive and evil and twisted. Less civilized than the Caucasian races, okay? Let's just admit it. They were beaten by those more civilized than they were. That's the way it's going to go, see? Darwin speculates that an endless number of the lower races would one day be eliminated by the higher races throughout the world. And all of this represented, as he said it in his words, quote, "the struggle for existence," end quote. He saw these wars and these battles as evidence of his theory of evolution in action. The full title of his landmark book, Origin of Species, says this: "The origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life." Preserving the favored races. That's what happens in natural selection. The only conclusion we can draw from the historical record is that Darwinian evolution leads to a belief that some so-called races of people are more highly evolved than are other races of people. And this idea is just a natural consequence of the theory. It's natural selection after all. And it's even suggested here in the book title. Now, Darwin was not the sole promoter or the originator of racism, of course. I'm not saying that, obviously. Racism has existed for centuries, and in nearly all cultures, on all sides. But Darwin's theories lent scientific credibility, you see, to the notion that some races are superior to other races. Oh, it's scientifically proven now. We can follow the science. We can justify our racism by the science. It's a scientific fact. We have to do this. This notion blended very well with the idea of social Darwinism, which is defined as a 19th century theory inspired by Darwinism, by which the social order is accounted as the product of natural selection of those persons best suited to existing living conditions. The social order, the classes, all right, the higher class, those folks are better suited to existing living conditions in their time and in their place. And it's in accord, okay, with which a position of laissez-faire is advocated. So this had economic implications as well then, you see. That's what this phrase, a position of laissez-faire is advocated, refers to. It's talking about economics within the social order, within the society. Laissez-faire is the theory or system of government that upholds the autonomous character of the economic order. That the economic order operates itself. It doesn't need any help or want any help from anybody outside of it, believing that government should intervene as little as possible in the direction of economic affairs. The idea is that a free market economy is the most conducive environment to allow for the struggle of life to have its way. It's the best way for the successful races of people to bubble up to the top, to the higher class. Now, that's not making an argument against a free market economy, all right? But what it does mean is that people of a sinful heart, some free market advocates, would use Darwinism as a supposed scientific justification for the free market. It's why we have to do this. In fact, I would say this. In reality, it all leads to a government with more control over its citizens. Ultimately, that's what would happen. A government with more control over its citizenry is actually a better fit for Darwinian evolution's goals, because that's what's happening in our world. The people who bubble to the top, why they bubble to the top, and so therefore they're more advanced, and so they should lead the rest of us. Today we see an ever-increasing trend toward this kind of centralized global governance, set up as an oligarchy, which is, quote, a form of government in which all power is vested in a few persons, or in, now catch this, in a dominant class or clique. Government by the few over the many, which is exactly what the Bible says is going to happen someday.
In fact, I would say that you can begin to see how this idea of evolution ends up being a whole lot more about a whole lot more areas of life than just simply biology. It becomes a way of life. That's why I said earlier that evolution is so much more a belief system than it is any kind of science. There may be scientists involved, but that's not necessarily guaranteeing that any of this is science. It's ideas. It's an ideology, and ideas have consequences. I believe that God created human beings, okay? And I believe that He created them, as I said, as one people. Now, you see, this belief of mine, this idea that I hold, that's therefore, if I really believe it, it's going to affect what I also believe and what I do about the rest of mankind, how I view my fellow human beings. There is an entire subset of systematic theology, basically a theology according to different systems and so forth, how they work together, that the Bible teaches. And they're usually those different ones. There's usually about 12 categories that I've seen, and they're usually listed in the same or a similar order, by order of importance, you might say, or whatever, in what the Bible talks about and deals with. And there's one subset of that theology called anthropology. Anthropology comes from two Greek words, anthropos and logos. It simply means the word, logos is the word, or the word about man. Anthropos is man, right? So it's the study of mankind. And with biblical theology, we're looking at mankind through a biblical lens. That's biblical anthropology. It leads to a biblical view of what it means to be a human, what the Bible tells us. If you have been a Christian for a while, you yourself have no doubt come to accept some basic premises of biblical anthropology, basic biblical ideas about humanity. Number one, like we're created in God's image. In other words, we have the God-given capacity to reflect God in who we are, in what we do, in what we think, and in what we say, the actions that we take. But we know also from the Bible that mankind, we, have sinned against God, and we have broken fellowship with him. Therefore, we now have lost our spiritual connection with our Creator. And so our nature is fallen from what it originally was. We therefore are incapable at this point on our own to reflect God as we should, as we were designed to do. This is our state. This is our condition. We need deliverance from it. We need salvation. We need a Savior. Okay? All of those thoughts and teachings are part of what we might call biblical anthropology, a biblical view of man. And there are other aspects to that as well, but these are some ones that are pretty common to all of us. But of course, there's also a secular, evolution-based anthropology. And if you've talked about or heard about or watched on television, PBS or someplace, talk about anthropology, this is the kind that you've been exposed to. This is what you've been taught. The biblical anthropology came first, by the way. Evolution, see, also has a view of what it means to be a human. And in our recent lessons that we've had here, we've looked into the evolutionary view about human origins, where we came from according to evolution. That's a part of that secular anthropology. No God was involved, right? Instead, everything evolved. And the evolutionary view naturally leads to the assumption that some human beings have evolved further down the scale, up the scale, than have others. You know, that means that no longer is the statement in the Declaration of Independence relevant. I thought about this as I was putting this together. This statement that says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. I mean, they're so obvious, we don't have to prove them to you. They're evident, they're common sense, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable, unchangeable, unmanipulable rights. They can't be changed. These are basic and fundamental to what it means to be a human being, is what they're saying. And among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the current system of thought has thrown God under the bus. Now maybe it's starting to become clearer to you why some of our rights in this country are not really being protected as much as they once were. No one believes we have them anymore. You see, there's a higher class of people. There's an elite group. Evolution is conducive, you see, to this situation we're in. The superior race gets first dibs on everything. They have rights that we don't have. Things don't apply to them like they apply to the rest of us. Is this not what we see? Again, Darwin did not originate racism or anything like it, but his ideas certainly enhanced it. His ideas made racism respectable. E.J. Larson, in his book Trial and Error, The American Controversy Over Creation and Evolution, said with respect to high school textbooks, public high schools were teaching evolution decades before the anti-evolution crusade that was in the 1920s. Okay, that's
what we talked about when we talked about the Scopes trial in 1925 and the fundamentalists who were reacting to the teaching of evolution in the schools. Okay? But here he's saying public high schools were teaching evolution decades before the anti-evolution crusade. They were driving it home to the students. We have to get our kids to believe this. With the presentation seeming to grow more dogmatically Darwinian over time. In other words, here's what the idea was, and in time it's like, here's what the idea is, this is what the truth is, this is what science tells us, and they drive it home further and further as time goes by. Not just in biology text either. For example, Steinwer and Brinton's 1881 geography text, Intermediate Geography with Lessons in Map Drawing, concluded a discussion on racism, or race rather, races of men, with this summation. The white race is superior to all the others in intelligence and civilization. Oh, wow. Take note of the illustration on the title page of this book. Take a look at what's happening there. Are they making an effort to stress the superiority of the land surveyors over the indigenous peoples, who obviously didn't have the knowledge to invent such really cool tools like transits and compasses and such? Wow. A 1914 high school biology textbook by one George Hunter was used as evidence in the Scopes monkey trial in 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee. It was a central part of the case. And in Hunter's chapter on evolution, in a segment called The Races of Man, which you see with the red arrow there, George Hunter wrote this. At the present time, there exist upon the earth 5 races or varieties of man, each very different from the other in instinct, social customs, and to an extent in structure or physical appearance. These are the Ethiopian or Negro type, originating in Africa, the Malay or brown race from the islands of the Pacific, the American Indian, the Mongolian or yellow race, including the natives of China, Japan, and the Eskimos, and finally, notice this class, the highest type of all, the Caucasians, represented by the civilized white inhabitants of Europe and America. Oh, wow. Civilized. They like that word. Man, George, why don't you just tell us how you really feel, buddy? But this wasn't the only tragic statement in his textbook. On the Discovery Institute's website called Evolution News, writer David Klinghoffer posted an article entitled Wikipedia on Hunter's Civic Biology. Okay, this is the Wikipedia article about George Hunter's book, Civic Biology. You can look it up on Wikipedia, Civic Biology. And so this fellow, David Klinghoffer, is critiquing Wikipedia's article, all right? They're trying to downplay the racism in the book. They say that he only put that on one page, and that was the page that you're looking at right there, okay? That's the only page in the whole book that he talks about racism, all right? But in critiquing Wikipedia's article on Hunter's book, A Civic Biology, Mr. Klinghoffer asked this question, what is the civic aspect of biology? Where does that factor into biology, the civic side of it? How we approach society, how we approach life. That's a good question. In 1914, what is a civilized society supposed to be doing within that society with all of its vast evolutionary biology wisdom? How do we make that biology come to bear on the society that we want to have as civilized people? At this point, it might be good to give you a working definition from Wikipedia, actually, here, on what the practice of eugenics is. We need to talk about this. Knowing a little bit about eugenics will help you to see what is so radically wrong with George Hunter's comments in his Civic Biology book. Eugenics is a set of beliefs and practices that aim to improve the genetic quality of a human population. Well, that sounds pretty good. We should try to clean up our genes, right? Have a better quality of genes in the human population. But how was this done? Historically, by excluding people and groups judged to be inferior or promoting those judged to be superior. Okay, so we're making judgment calls saying one group of people is inferior, and we want to downplay that and get rid of that kind of people because we want to promote those who are superior. These are the ones we want to produce. These are the ones we want to carry on our legacy, etc., etc., etc. I used this eugenics propaganda poster you see there last week at the very end of the lesson. Maybe you took note of it there. Only healthy seed must be sown. Check the seeds of hereditary disease and unfitness. He's not talking about physical fitness there, just unfit. You're not unfit to be a representative of humans, okay? Check the seeds of hereditary disease and unfitness by eugenics. That's how we do it, okay? Keep certain people from breeding. Ideas like mandatory sterilization of those deemed unfit to breed made up part of the eugenics philosophical arsenal. Again, keep in mind, all of this came about. Why? Because of the doctrines of Darwinian evolution, justifying this. Darwin's work gave some kind of seemingly scientific justification, scientific credibility for things like this that began to unfold as the 20th century opened up. In his evolution news article about Wikipedia and George Hunter's civic biology textbook, David Klinghoffer writes this: the discussion of eugenics is nothing less than the capstone and punchline of Hunter's chapter on heredity and variation. He's moving to a different chapter now. The chapter works logically, hitting themes including Charles Darwin and natural selection. That must be a particular subsection of the chapter. Or another one, artificial selection. Okay, not natural selection. This is artificial. This is deliberate intervention by the civilized society to say this is what we will breed. And then animal breeding. Okay, let's talk about it in terms of animal breeding. We do this all the time to get a better animal, a better breed, blah, 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 blah. The general discussion of eugenics, the science of being well born, extends from page 261 to page 264. And he says that's 4 pages there, not 1. So he's saying that the Wikipedia is trying to downplay this. You know, I was thinking about this today. They're trying to downplay the Hunter's racism. They're trying to make it subtle. It's just 1 page. It's just 1 page. Now, it's 5 pages. All right, on 5 different pages. All right, four pages solid on that. We just had a paragraph on the 1 page. This is 4 pages solid of selling this whole idea of eugenics. Okay. The only reason you would downplay somebody's racism and say that really is not as bad as all that and cut them some slack is because they have ideas or something else that you really want to continue. You really want it to be propagated. You want it to go on. See what I'm saying? He's not as bad as all that. There's some really good things that George Hunter says in his book. And I'm betting pages 261 to 264 is what they were thinking. I like what Klinghoffer says here. Hunter's remedy for poorly bred humans is chilling. His remedy, his solution. Can you see the eugenics influence here? Klinghoffer highlights here that Hunter felt the need to come up with some kind of remedy to deal with these people that need to be kept from breeding. And then Klinghoffer quotes George Hunter's book, and I'm going to show it to you right out of the book. This is the page. Klinghoffer has this with his article, actually. This is the very page, and I've highlighted the section that deals with this. This is the remedy. If such people were lower animals, we would probably kill them off to prevent them from spreading. Humanity will not allow this. But we do have, he sounds like he's disappointed there, but we do have the remedy of separating the sexes in asylums or other places, and in various ways prevent intermarriage and the possibilities of perpetuating such a low and degenerate race. Oh, we just don't want that. Remedies of this sort have been tried successfully in Europe. Well, I'll bet Adolf Hitler, and are now meeting with success in this country. Oh, success, if that's how you define success, I guess. Just look at the influence of Darwin's ideas on this man's thinking. Look at what he says. If such people were lower animals, such people, that means lower people, lesser people. George Hunter sees these people as being closer to animals than what he is. Because we've all come from animals, but I'm further away. And this is in 1914. If they were much lower, he says, we would probably kill them off to keep them from spreading. Absolutely unbelievable. But hey, answer me this. Do you think that the human heart is any nobler today than it was 100 years ago? What does the Bible tell you about the human heart? It's deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Do you really believe that people in charge of things today are better than Mr. Hunter here? Do you really think so? I mean, I certainly hope they are. But I'll be honest with you, I'm not very optimistic, not with what I've been seeing lately. They're pulling off all the gloves. It used to be conspiracy theories were hidden, right? Not anymore. It's out in the open. They just tell you what they're going to do and how they're going to be. This is the way it is. Get used to it. It's the Great Reset. Look at this poster again. Only healthy seed must be sown. See, back then they weren't able to manipulate gene expression like is possible today, to alter genes, to change genes, and to make things gooder than what they were when we got them. So their solutions to keep undesirables, or maybe we could use the word deplorables, to keep the deplorables from breeding, were to separate them from each other, or sterilization, to sterilize them altogether so they couldn't have babies. The belief is, folks, that by controlling genetics, the human race will evolve at a faster rate. It is what George Hunter is talking about here. It is what Adolf Hitler was trying to actually carry out. And it is also what more people than we might imagine are trying to do today, only with much more sophisticated technology, better technique. The technology may have improved, but the human heart is still every bit as selfish and sinful as it was 100 years ago. It just can express itself better now because the technology is really good. Take a look at this poster. Eugenics, it says in the center there. Eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. Artificial selection, okay? The self-direction. We're going to direct evolution the way we want it to go. Isn't it great that we got smart enough to do this? And underneath there, like a tree, eugenics draws its materials from many sources and organizes them into a harmonious entity. Wow, that almost sounds meditative, like all my chakras are lined up. It sounds like New Age movement philosophy. That's kind of interesting to me, because you know the New Age was really coming into being around this same time in the West, with Helena Blavatsky and others that were following her ways. So hey, maybe there's a connection here. We're evolving. We're getting gooder and gooder. We're becoming like gods. Look at all the disciplines they claim were involved in this. Anatomy, physiology, history, genetics, psychology, biology, anthropometry. I don't even know what that is, but there it is. That's a root, man. Geology, anthropology, archaeology, ethnology, geography. Oh, the guys with the great transits and compasses and stuff. Law, statistics, economics, genealogy. Oh, there's a good one, right? My ancestors came over on the Mayflower. Oh, yeah, you ever wonder where that little joke comes from? Eugenics. Biography, politics, education, religion, sociology, psychiatry, surgery, and medicine. All these wonderful endeavors, disciplines, and humanitarian studies, all woven together in a harmonious tapestry designed to improve the higher races of people. Now, a source for some of what I've been sharing with you this evening has been this particular essay by Jerry Bergman entitled Darwinism and the Teaching of Racism and Eugenics in Biology Textbooks. That's where I've got some of this information. You can find Jerry Bergman's article as a PDF file. You could download it if you wanted to keep it. You can find it on the website for Creation Ministries International at www.creation.com. I put it up there on a little banner for you so you can write it down if you got a way to do that, if you want to get into this a little bit more. I encourage you to do your own research into this information. There's more than what I'm able to cover here. There's so much direction we could go with this. It wasn't hard to find information on this. Discussing George Hunter's textbook of civic biology, Bergman, he writes this: this book, widely adopted by American public high schools for over 30 years, was the same textbook that John Scopes used as a substitute biology teacher, and was the one he used when convicted of violating the Butler Act, the law against teaching evolution in public schools. That was in Tennessee, right? The Butler Act. This book also advocated the now discredited concept of eugenics, for which Nazi Germany has now become infamous. Okay, so eugenics got a big shoot down when the Nazis actually took everybody seriously. John Scopes used a civic biology as a textbook when he substituted in the Dayton, Tennessee high school biology class. And that was the same book that the American Civil Liberties Union, which is not American, does not stand for civil liberties at all, and they're not unified in any way, that they defended that book at the Scopes trial. Hence, Hunter's biology textbook was widely used in the United States. There's no way to tell, but I have to wonder if that open book in front of John Scopes there in this 1925 photo, if that's George Hunter's A Civic Biology. I figure likely it is. That's the book that was central to the case. I mean, you'd think the press would want him posing with the actual book that he used in class, just for authenticity, right? In his article, Jerry Bergman then says that a similar school textbook was printed in early Nazi Germany. Well, I bet. Life Sciences Biology Textbook for High Schools by Dr. Erich Meyer and Dr. Karl Zimmermann with Dr. Werner Dietrich. Sound like German guys. The focus in the German textbook was not upon dark-skinned peoples. Rather, the writers castigated the poor genetic stock of Jews and Gypsies. That's what we've got to eliminate. These rather primitive races are physically as well as mentally far behind the highly developed. They're teaching this to kids, okay, just so you know what's going on. That Hitler had his Hitler Youth, right? And this is indoctrination into the whole thing. These rather primitive races are physically as well as mentally far behind the highly developed races, the Aryan race, the white race, right? Henceforth leaving a primeval impression. The most highly developed races are the master races. Greater aptitude enabled them to found superior cultures and civilizations, the Romans, the Greeks, and on and on. Just imagine if statements like this had appeared in your textbook when you were in school. Imagine if your children, your grandchildren, or your great-grandchildren were being taught that there are lesser races and higher races of human beings. and that we needed to do things in our society to make sure the superior races had every possible advantage. Remember, all of this grew up out of the ideas proposed in Darwinian evolution. Ideas have consequences. Nazi Germany. Jerry Bergman cites more quotes from this German high school biology textbook. The disharmony of the Jewish racial mixture is apparent also in the frequency of certain diseases, specifically the obvious flat feet, among others. Diabetes is 4 times as common as in other nationalities. But the most repugnant features of the Jewish people root in their mental and moral disposition. Major characteristics, therefore, are craftiness, physical and mental uncleanness, cruelty, greed, a distaste for physical labor, particularly the vocation of farmer or soldier. It is therefore right to view Jews as a parasitic nation, or a racial mix of parasitic characteristics that causes its host nation only disadvantage and spells disaster. The calamity brought upon Europe, initiated by the emancipation of Jewry, which gave them equal civil and political rights, was nearly disastrous. The Gypsy nation is also a foreign body and consequently has to be rejected. Above all, it is our sacred and civil duty to protect our blood from being contaminated with alien blood, especially Jewish blood. No greater shame can be inflicted on the honor of the German nation than the breaking of this law. Wow! Our sacred and civil duty to protect our blood from being contaminated with alien blood, especially Jewish blood. Just wow. I mean, what can you really say about such heinous, inhumane doctrine like this? I mean, I know this kind of information is not pleasant to listen to. It's not pleasant to read to you. I feel crummy doing it. But this is why, folks, even the evil things in human history, why they need to be preserved and why they need to be remembered. This is why knocking down of statues and so forth will, in the long run, result in generations to come who no longer know or have any chance of remembering what had once happened. And it only increases the likelihood of it happening again, especially if you believe, as I do, that the human heart is corrupt at the core. And being of the disposition that I am, I find myself asking the question, for those who urged angry mobs to take down statues in the recent riots in our country, what if erasing the past was exactly their point? What if that's exactly what these instigators intended, so that one day in the future, evil could emerge again, unsuspected, unanticipated, unchallenged, and even encouraged by the general population? A lot to think about. Returning to America, I found another article on the Creation Ministries International website written by Russell Grigg entitled "Hooray for Eugenics: How American Bible-Rejecting Churches Supported Nazi-like Policies." Now, isn't that something you want to read? Grigg writes this: "The many violations of human rights and the killings and genocides which are the result of eugenicist beliefs are well documented and so are well known. What is not so well known is that in the early 20th century, eugenics was promoted with almost evangelistic fervor in American elite circles, leading to the forced sterilization of over 60,000 U.S. citizens and even euthanasia. Even worse, it was ardently promoted by many of the liberal mainline churches in America." The liberal mainline churches, see, these are the opposite of the fundamentalist churches that were opposed to the teaching of evolution in schools at the time. The liberal mainline churches in America had completely abandoned the sufficiency of Scripture as their foundation. They left the Bible altogether. Their only alternative would be, of course, the current trends in man-made culture and academia. That's their only place to go, and that's where they want to go. Not much different from churches today that have left biblical moorings. They have to find help from psychology and psychiatry and other areas of expertise, evolutionary biology and evolutionary astronomical observations and so forth. The late 19th century and early 20th centuries in America, getting some historical context here, saw a large influx of immigration from southern and eastern Europe. The area, by the way, that the Nazis said was the worst stock coming in Europe from those areas. Industrialization was increasing in urban areas especially, and this led to people leaving the farms and heading into the cities to find work. And the new immigrants also found work in the shops and the factories, like these men here. This created a whole host of social issues, like child labor, for example. These boys here worked in a coal mine in Pennsylvania. Birth rates were declining, divorce rates were on the rise, there was a near epidemic of syphilis in the country. And as a consequence of this plethora of ills, many were worried about the state of the American family. Enter the eugenicists. You see, the problem with all these situations, it wasn't sin. It wasn't moral failures. The problem, you see, was a scientific problem. And so they were there, the American Eugenics Society and others, to provide an answer to society's woes coming from science. Does any of this sound familiar to anyone else at all? They said, we need to have the superior humans, the white middle-class Anglo-Saxon types. We need them to produce larger families, while the racially and mentally inferior types need to be restrained from further breeding. This will fix the problem. You see, the problem is we've got bad genes. And we've got to get better genes. That's salvation. See, that's the way to deliver man from his woes. See, that's essentially the eugenics answer to social ills. Now, see, for those churches that had abandoned the Bible, they didn't rely on that anymore. This scientific social solution, well, that fit perfectly with their new ideas about a social gospel. That the church is the agency of God that has been sent out to redeem society. We're the saviors, you see. That's what Christ has sent us out to do. This is what they believed. Russell Grigg writes this: thus, in the early decades of the 20th century, clerics, rabbis, and lay leaders wrote books and articles about eugenics, joined eugenics organizations, and adopted eugenics solutions to the social problems that beset their communities. They explored the eugenic implications of the biblical 10 Commandments and investigated the hereditary lessons embedded in the parables of Jesus. This is honest stuff that they were doing. Many churches ran eugenics education classes. In 1910, psychologist Stanley Hall wrote in the journal Religious Education, the entire Old Testament, from the myth of Eden to the latest prophets, needs a new eugenics exegesis. Myth of Eden. Not too hard to see where Stanley Hall's coming from. He's taking away from the Bible. It's just a myth there, that whole thing. Exegesis, that means that's the way you interpret the Bible, how you exegete the Scriptures, what you draw out of the Scriptures. So right there, Stanley Hall was saying that to run the Bible passages, to exegete them properly, for today, we need to run those passages through the lens of what we're learning about eugenics, and then we need to reinterpret the Bible with eugenics ideas in mind. Folks, that's adding to the Scriptures. So, see, this is Hall's approach here. And the liberal approach generally. Take away a little over here and a little over there, and add a little bit over here and add a little bit more over there, and pretty soon you can dress up the Bible to say whatever you want it to say. Don't worry about what God wanted it to say. In his article, Russell Grigg describes what was happening, some of what was happening in churches that were in support of the eugenics movement. In 1912, the Reverend Walter Sumner, the dean of the Episcopal Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul, both of them together in Chicago, required that couples wanting to be married in the cathedral must produce a eugenics health certificate. You got to have the right kind of health paperwork to be able to participate in society. I mean, we don't have things like that today, but, well, anyway. A physician had to attest that they were normal physically and mentally and have neither an incurable nor communicable disease. Does this sound familiar to you at all? Some denominations approved and copied this procedure. Others, for example, some Presbyterians, did not. Catholics mostly did not, as they regarded marriage as a sacrament to be regulated only by the church. In 1926, you didn't get the government involved. In 1926, hundreds of preachers took part in a eugenics sermon contest. Oh, that sounds like fun. Sponsored by the American Eugenics Society. Dr. Christine Rosen comments on this. In eugenics, these men found a faith stronger than their Christianity, fulfilling Francis Galton's hope of replacing religion with eugenics. See, that's what Francis Galton, he's the guy that came up with the word eugenics back in the 1880s. So he was hoping that eugenics would eventually replace religion. And can't you see, it's touching every aspect of society because it comes from every aspect of society. It's the overall solution to everything. Okay, so here's the takeaways for tonight's lesson. First, understand. Racism is a natural outcome of the theory of evolution. It's the way that it's the logical conclusion. It's the inevitable result of thinking your way through evolution theory. That's where you end up. Racism, some people are just more highly evolved than other people groups. The idea is that some people groups are more highly evolved. Other people groups didn't make it as far yet. And so you have a superior class of people automatically. Secondly, eugenics was a means of trying to preserve those more highly evolved people through the encouragement of large white families while working to prevent the racially inferior and the mentally unfit from having any children at all. That's the way to advance our evolution artificially, for us to take control over our destiny. Improve the stock, right? Lastly, the key thing here is the advancing of an ideology, a belief system, where humans take over their own evolutionary future. And that's still very much in vogue. Eugenics, as such as it was back then, may be passé and politically incorrect to the max. But it doesn't mean that the ideas behind it aren't still around. Instead of natural selection controlling the breeding, let's decide for ourselves who gets to breed and who doesn't. Or who gets to preserve what genetic material they have while others don't. And in case you think that kind of thinking is now gone, consider for a moment how much more is now known about DNA, about genetics and gene expression in our day, and the technology we have to manipulate that and to splice and to insert and to take out genetic information. The technology has much advanced. The goal, though, is still the same. Nothing's changed there. We want to be like God. We'll talk more about these things in the weeks ahead. You folks, take care. Have a good night.